It's my really great pleasure to bring Professor Gonzalez to talk to us. Let me just, as a way of very short introduction, I met her in UMBC, or was it one of the subtle meetings?
We met first in Cerdal,
Sort of,
and then UMBC.
UMBC, that's right. Where she gave this very, very powerful, she led a panel in which they discussed the topic that she's going to be talking about, just around the same topic. And then so I approached her and I said, I want you to come to our campus and lead this same discussion. And so I'm so glad that that you could join us. She's a professor in higher ed at Michigan State. And so this is very, very important. This is one of those topics that we as colleagues have talked about. What is in diversity for me? What is the gain? How do I do this? And so she led this discussion, group of faculty members, and actually delved so deep into this topic. There were three of them that did this. So please join me in welcoming her. She has a lot to give us, so we expect to learn from you. And by the way, your topic today actually fit into the series of the things that we are doing. And Mary just had a fantastic workshop on Friday. And so this is really, really time, so everything is falling in place. So let's give her a big warm welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for having me here today. I'm really excited to share with you a bit about the work that I do in higher education, particularly around faculty careers and how faculty can work to sort of reimagine their teaching, their advising, their research teams in ways that really embrace diversity. And we're going to go ahead and sort of define what diversity means in just a minute. So thank you, Sylvanus, for inviting me. Thank you for friends for being in the room. Mary, it's good to see you here. So I'm going to go ahead and just read out for you the title of the workshop, because I put a lot of thinking into this title. It may seem sort of straightforward, but there's a lot of intentionality here. So diversity matters, but equity matters most. Today we're going to spend our time thinking through concepts that are often used interchangeably, but that mean quite different things. And we're going to talk a little bit about why equity matters most. And we're going to think about some diagnostics or ways to sort of check ourselves and our practices to think about, are we moving towards diversity? Are we moving towards inclusion? Or are we moving towards the highest level equity? So this is going to be a bit of our agenda, give and take. I'm going to start off with some welcoming comments, and really my welcoming comments are about me sharing a little bit about myself with you. That's important because it's a way to model some of the information that our students often want to know about us and how we approach our work. It also, though, is sort of a way to highlight how we think about our discipline, you being in engineering, me being my past life. I spent my time mostly in political science and sociology. I landed in higher education. But by sharing information about myself with you, I model what I do with my students. I give them a sense of how I've come in to the discipline and how I understand career and work, so on and so forth. We're going to spend a bit of time talking about your views and some of the things that you think about, that you fear perhaps, when it comes to doing diversity-related work, and some of the questions that you might have. Then we're going to spend a good portion of our time, and I'm going to walk around a lot just because that's my tendency. We're going to spend a good portion of our time today defining and distinguishing concepts, going back to what I said early on. And then we're going to spend some time doing some application, playing around with diagnostics. Our application time is going to be very context grounded, meaning that I'm going to ask you to work in small pairs or groups to think about situations in which you could move towards diversity, towards inclusion, towards equity. But I want them to be situations that you've faced in the classroom, in your advising relationships, or perhaps in building your research projects and research teams. Everybody with me? Okay. So a little bit about myself. My name is Leslie Gonzalez. I am, as Sylvana said, I am an associate professor of higher education at Michigan State University. My research centers on issues that faculty face in their careers. More specifically, I'm very interested in how faculty members from non-dominant or underrepresented backgrounds strive to sort of earn value or earn legitimacy in the eyes of their colleagues, or when scholars who take up interdisciplinary or unconventional approaches to their scholarship, how they try to make that work fit in their departments or their disciplines. This is a big issue for people who do interdisciplinary scholarship but find themselves in a discipline that is quite sort of insular, and that's the language we would use in higher ed. So that's sort of my background academically. I grew up in a ranch and in a farm setting. My first few, well, until I was about 12, I lived in a very small farming community in northern Texas, where the farming community was sort of split up in two ways. You were either a fairly wealthy landowner who had farms and who employed working class, often migrant families. My dad was a migrant farm worker up until he was a senior in high school, meaning my dad traveled between New Mexico and Texas, sometimes Colorado, with his family. My mom grew up very much also working class. She was the daughter of a cook and of a maid. And so this makes me what I often call myself to my students, a working class, first generation student turned academic. Sharing that kind of information with my students often opens up some really interesting conversations. If they're first generation, it can be incredibly important for them to say, oh, okay, she's first generation too. I can do this. There's a possibility here, right? If I can talk about the fact that I attended 2 Hispanic serving institutions, which are rather not well known, they're not super fancy, they're not elite institutions, it opens up an opportunity to converse with my students around what that can look like, what that means, how one might have to prepare for a career in the professoriate. So this is a little bit about myself that I wanted to share with you. I also want you to go ahead and take a moment, maybe about 30 seconds or so, to kind of think about the things that make you who you are and approach the discipline the way that you do. I want you to kind of think about those. You can jot them down, or you can just kind of keep them in the back of your mind, because we're going to circle back to it later on in the workshop. Okay. So I'll give you just about 30 seconds to do that. So what are some of the key things that you grew up with in your life? Where did you grow up with? Are you a first-gen college student? Did you go to a very well-resourced institution? Did you have mentors? Are you or have you ever been the only one in a classroom? I've often been the first and the only, for example, the first Latina in my department at Clemson University, the first Latina to get tenure in my department at Michigan State. So have you ever been the first or the only? Think about those things. We're going to circle back to them later. So now that you have a bit of a sense of me, and maybe some of the things that might play into how I think about our work in academia, as professors, as colleagues to our students, these are some of the things that I hope that you leave with today. I hope that you leave this workshop today, number one, and this isn't noted up here, with some models and some strategies around how do we talk about ourselves as academics with our students, which is incredibly important. How do we open up those lines of communications in culturally relevant, non-judgmental ways? But most specifically, I hope that you leave today understanding the difference between diversity, inclusion, and equity. So those are going to be the 3 major concepts that we're going to spend time with today. I hope that you understand the relationship between diversity, inclusion, and equity. I'm going to talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity almost as scaffolding or being sort of a cyclical process in which one has to lay a foundation, improve it a bit, and then really sort of test out the outcomes of that prior work and continue to work on it some more. So I'm hoping that you all leave today understanding the relationship between diversity, inclusion, and equity. And then finally, and probably most important to you, I want to be able to talk with you about some strategies. I call them sort of diagnostic strategies that you can think about in relation to key roles that you play as a faculty member. Those key roles being teaching, advising, and mentoring, which are different things, and we can talk about that. And then research, building your research team, running your research lab, so on and so forth. Is everyone with me? All right, great. So before we jump into the actual workshop content, I would like to ask you, to think about, for just a few minutes, maybe about 3 minutes or so, what is diversity to you? And what is its value, if any, to the field of engineering? And finally, I want you to take some time in the next 3 to 4 minutes to write down a few thoughts about when you think about diversity work, diversity-related efforts, what are some of the thoughts that come to mind? What are some of the questions you have, some of the concerns that you may have? So first, what does diversity mean to you? Second, what is the value, if any, of diversity in engineering? And then finally, I'm going to ask you to think about the questions you may have, the concerns, the sticking points, right? Sometimes you're really interested in doing it, but you sort of run into the wall. You run into a sticking point. So I'm going to be quiet and give you about 3 minutes of time to reflect. As you write your answers, I want to again stress that this is sort of a non-judgment zone. If there should be any place where you can feel free to ask questions or sort of stumble over something, this is the time to do it. We're all here invested as learners. And so I just think that's important to sort of put it out there.
It's recorded for posterity.
It is recorded. We might have to shut down the recording.
You're sitting back in the corner where you're not okay.
Get out of the camera's view. About 2 minutes. Yeah. About 1 minute. Okay, we're getting right to that time mark. So as a way to ask folks to participate, I want to first just get a sense of who's in the room. So how many graduate students do I have in the room? Okay. Postdocs? No postdocs. Faculty? Majority faculty. Okay. Do I have faculty who play admin, faculty admin hybrid roles? Okay. All right. Okay, so that's helpful to me just in sort of shaping my thinking. We have a staff in here also? We have staff in here also. Yay, okay, great. Great. Okay, so I would like to ask folks to remain aware of the power dynamics that are in the room and to make sure that we all can agree that this should be a non-judgment zone, right? Folks are going to ask questions. People might stumble a bit. All right. Let's get started with the first one. What does diversity mean to you? Can I have just a few people give their ideas?
Representation of lots of groups.
Representation of lots of groups.
Team skills, experiences, and talents, but they all need to have the same dedication and desire.
Okay, okay. So representation of lots of groups, lots of talents, but leading towards the same or similar kind of desire, sort of a similar outcome.
I put input or participation from a diverse group of people with diverse backgrounds in areas of interest or expertise.
I think it's got something to do with a willingness on the part of myself to be open to and willing to accept that others come from different whatever milieus and have different backgrounds and offer different insights into the problems we confront.
So this is an important, when we talk about diversity work, and I'll define diversity work in a moment, when we talk about diversity work, it's really always important to think about self and others, right? It's a relational kind of thing. It's not just we need to find those people that represent certain backgrounds, but it's also in terms of how do we engage with people who may be a bit different from us in a variety of ways, whether it's experience, how they talk about their knowledge, how they engage in conversations, so on and so forth. Do we have one more definition of diversity that people might want to share?
I said having a voice.
Having a voice.
Having a voice that is respected.
Everyone having a voice that is respected. Again, getting to that sort of relational thing, right? It's not this one-dimensional thing. What is the value of diversity in engineering? Why are you here today? Because oftentimes folks that show up to these places, we're the chorus, right? We're the people who are interested in these issues. Go ahead, Mary.
So we solve problems. And the problems that we solve are representative of people of all sorts and sizes and situations and environments. Therefore, we need people from diverse backgrounds and all the definitions that you heard that can contribute to understanding that problem to solve it.
Anyone else? What are some concerns that we have when we take up diversity work? When I say diversity work, in higher education, because I study higher education, I study colleges and universities, we have a lot of diversity initiatives, right? We have a lot of efforts to diversify the faculty, to diversify or to diversify student cohorts. We have a lot of efforts around cultural relevance and inclusivity. So that's what I mean when I talk about diversity work. So what are some of the concerns that we have in engaging in this work?
To me, one of the challenges is we operate typically on whatever we're incentivized to do, and I can't think of a situation where there's a real incentive long-term to revolve around diversity, a direct correlation.
So it doesn't manifest in sort of a long-term incentive. It's hard to put our finger on it, at least a tangential one or an
It's
immediately
not from
apparent
my
one.
View, yeah. We say we want to be diverse, but does that mean just adding X number of people, or does that mean it goes towards outcomes or whatever? I don't know if maybe it's a step process. I don't know.
Yeah, it's got something to do also coming back to different viewpoints and whatnot. In talking about teams, does everyone on the team share the same objectives in terms of doing something? You know, you got to deal with multiple personal objectives in all of this.
Do we sometimes feel, go ahead please.
I don't know how to measure success. I think it relates to your point as well. Is it just by counting, or is that a true impact? Or is it just, are we just competing for the same pool of people that we want to bring in? Is that really what it's about?
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that often happens in diversity work, at least according to the higher education research, is that you have initiatives, you have efforts, and you talk about diversifying. And so maybe that means cluster hiring, right? Bringing in a racially, ethnically diverse pool of faculty members, or maybe it means that you are very mindful in terms of your admission processes and how you think about how you want to build a cohort of students, thinking about diversity in a lot of different ways. But then it kind of stops because you're like, all right, great, we got a more diverse student body. We made up a class that's more diverse and we're excited, right? But you're so right. Will you give me your name, please, in the back? Abro, you're so right. It's hard to measure success in diversity. And that's because it's only surface level. Like getting a diverse group, it's the counting, right? And so what we want to talk about today is how can we move beyond diversity to think about inclusivity in our practices, particularly when we're constructing curriculum, when we're constructing our research groups, when we're thinking about how we bring people into our processes, whatever those processes might be. So let's go ahead and walk through the definitions. This is going to be the portion of the workshop where I talk a lot, so I might ask sometimes for y'all to help me out. But for the most part, this is going to be where I spend a lot of time using my voice. And then I promise I'm going to throw it back to you all. So for all of these reasons that you all have mentioned, we all like diversity, but it's hard to measure. We don't know what the real potential incentive is. We don't really know how to get to it. For all of these reasons, people who do diversity work have developed many formulas, many steps, many sort of ways of thinking about how to push past efforts to diversify. And so today, I'm going to have us define and distinguish 3 concepts that are often used interchangeably in order to be able to use these concepts, or maybe we want to think of them as constructs, things that are measurable, to diagnose how we're doing. Okay. So we're going to start sort of at that very base level, and I apologize because this text might be a bit light for the room. Think of diversity almost as your, I'm with engineers, so I better make sure my analogy works. Maybe think about diversity as the pebbles that you're going to use in cement or in concrete, the rocks, right? This is kind of relevant, right? Okay, diversity is the sum of individual differences, whether it's age, gender, race, ability, education, nationality, linguistic capabilities, many, many factors. Diversity, as many of you have already said, is accounted for in terms of numerical representation. This is a very popular way that people might come to think about diversity. Above the waterline are the things that tend to be more visible to the eye, right? And so these are the things that we often think about when we think about diversity in a hot minute. Below the surface are probably the more impactful forms of diversity. Political affiliations, where one grew up, sexuality, gender identity, the kinds of value systems that you might bring to the work. Maybe religion plays a role there. It's important that when we think about diversity, that we always avoid, so this is one of those kind of quick things I'm going to say that you might want to jot down. It's important that we avoid language like, oh, well, we can hire if it's a diverse candidate. Because individuals aren't diverse. To suggest that an individual is diverse, it means that there's like some sort of norm, right? Oh, we've got that one diverse one as compared to the norm. So it's important that we think about individual diversity, right? The myriad of factors that we bring into our work and how they might shape the dynamics of a group or a classroom. And by thinking about those various factors, we can construct diverse groups. So diversity is something that should be thought of at a group or organizational level. When you are building your research teams, when you are thinking about constructing admissions here, and I don't know how your admissions process works here specifically, but I know back in my department, we have an admissions process, right? And we have a cohort model. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how best to construct that cohort. We want to make sure that we have a diverse range of factors and backgrounds involved in that cohort. Why? Because we know that research shows that when there are more diversity of learners in a group, student learning outcomes are better. This is what the affirmative action ruling sort of hangs on at the Supreme Court level. The Supreme Court has only stuck to affirmative action in its much more watered down form than what it was initially because of the diversity rationale. They're saying social science and educational research has repeatedly shown that students report better learning and more democratic orientations when they sit in a classroom that is filled with people who are different than them. And you are linked to some of those resources in this PowerPoint, which I'll make available to you all via email. So as we think about individual diversity, in higher education, we are often compelled to think about diversity in ways that matter the most, in ways that as publicly funded institutions, we should keep track of diversity in this way. So sometimes I say we're going to track diversity, and then I'm going to say, think about diversity in ways that really, really matter, thinking about underrepresentation. So for example, these are statistics that come out of the American Society for Engineering Education, and they're the 2015 statistics. These statistics represent the baccalaureate degree completion rates among different racial and ethnic groups. You can see that this is racial ethnic groups in general and not racial ethnic plus gender or any other demographic factor. When we think about diversity, this is where we should be thinking in terms of like numbers, right? So we know that, for example, women have increasingly been making some headway in engineering, although that varies in different pockets of engineering. We know that when Latino and African American men come into engineering, they're often pulled from minority serving institutions. So that is sort of the extent to which diversity takes us. It's about numbers, it's about representation. Okay? So let me go ahead and walk that back. So when we think about diversity, you might ask yourself, how are we ensuring that we are constructing a pool that is diverse? And you might ask yourself to look at candidates in various ways. And we're going to go through some like checklists in a little while. When you're thinking about diversity, you may ask yourself, well, we hired or we brought in a more diverse student population, but how does that diverse student population fare in relation to the overall student population at the university? So you start to think about numbers and you start to think proportionally. Go ahead, did you have a question? Go ahead.
I'm just curious, I couldn't help noticing there's 0 on Native American Indian.
Yes.
That was something I've kind of had a personal interest in for a while. Is that excluded or is it just not?
That is a fantastic point. So when I say think about diversity in ways that it matters, I'm not saying that any one group matters more than the other, but I'm saying that think about diversity in ways that matter because sometimes our organizations, including our own universities, don't even collect data on certain groups because they're so small. So in higher education, in my field, there's actually a movement going on among Native Americans and American Indians that are saying, don't just make us the asterisk, because their participation and representation is so low that oftentimes they don't come out in the numbers. So we don't have any reports from SE on Native Americans. Maybe if you dug through the raw data, you can get it. But in terms of their annual report, they don't report out. So it's really important, right? So when you're thinking about diversity, think about the kinds of numbers you need to look at. Are you currently collecting numbers, for example, on ability? Are you collecting information when it comes to gender identity? Are you collecting information when it comes to the intersection of race, gender, and class? And if not, then what can we do to think about it in that way? Now, diversity is just about numbers, right? It's about constructing graphs like this and sort of saying, okay, where are we? It only goes so far, though. Diversity will only take us so far. Diversity allows us to generate a lot of reports. It allows us to sort of say how our recruitment efforts went, what our yield was, right? These are words that are very higher ed-ish, but tell me if they resonate. But they don't get to those more fundamental cultural issues. The issues that we know are the issues that lead to people leaving STEM generally, engineering maybe more specifically in some cases, right? I've often leaned on the work of, and if you don't know this work, I've cited it for you at the end of the presentation. I've often leaned on the work of Cynthia Foor and Susan Walden out of the University of Oklahoma, who have looked at cultures, departmental cultures in engineering to understand what are some of the sort of the invisible barriers or feelings of marginalization that women and students of color experience in those departments. So it may be that there is a number of students of color in a particular cohort in a particular year, but they're still reporting out these sort of feelings of marginalization, these feelings of isolation. And so you have to start thinking about culture, inclusivity, and changing those things that are very much invisible often to us because we are embedded in the profession. Getting us to inclusion. So inclusion is when the ideas, identities, knowledge, and values offered by historically underrepresented people are not only welcomed, right, but valued, leveraged, and utilized. Those are all very, very specific verbs that I've chosen and that higher education or equity researchers choose in general. So welcomed is one thing, right? Valued is another thing. Leveraged, right? And utilized. There's different kinds of actions, depths of action involved in those. Now, in general, when we think about inclusion, we can think about these various tenets. And again, y'all are going to have this. You have it in front of you. You'll have the electronic format. Inclusivity means being willing, first and foremost, us, as you said earlier. Excuse me, what was your name? Jack. Jack said earlier, it sort of has me involved, right? Like myself is sort of implicated in here. Inclusivity requires us doing some learning to recognize, all right, how do I be more welcoming? How do I try to connect with my students? How do I become maybe a bit, and this may feel odd, vulnerable when engaging with students, when engaging with postdocs, when talking about the academic labor market, departmental culture? It takes some self-work. These are some various kinds of activities that you can think about when you think about inclusion. Being listened to, this seems like a throwaway, but it's not. In some of my other work, kind of the heart of my work, I'm very interested in how faculty members who do interdisciplinary or sort of non-conventional scholarship in very purist disciplines, how they get their colleagues to listen to them when they're not doing the work in conventional ways. And a lot of the times when I talk to faculty who do this sort of non-conventional scholarship, they say, I just want to be listened to. I just need to get a chance to sort of articulate where I'm coming from, get them to give me the space to say that. Oftentimes we, again, in my research, I talk about this sort of notion of epistemic silencing, where you almost immediately silence someone who brings a different language than you do to your discipline. So being listened to is huge, right? Being given choices, being given the option to sort of take up and own part of the process, whether that's a research project or in the classroom. But my most favorite way to think about inclusion comes from a phenomenal Black woman who grew up in Harvard, extremely poor, went through law school, and who does this kind of work all the time in the course of her daily life. And she says, diversity is being asked to the dance, but inclusion is dancing. It's allowing you to dance, maybe allowing somebody to change the style of dance. It's letting people get fully involved. And that comes from Verna Myers, and she's also linked inside this PowerPoint. So think about the difference in that level, right? In diversity, we're thinking about numbers. All right, how can we recruit? All right, how can I construct a more diverse research team? Okay, can I build a partnership with the Chicano or American Indian or African American Studies program? Maybe there's some sort of potential there. Do I have any connections to the community college to tap into a more racially, ethnically diverse working class pool? What is the potential there? That's diversity, right? But that means bringing somebody in to your setting where you hold the power of that setting, right? And that means you're taking the responsibility to also let them dance, to lead the dance. Not just invite them in and say, all right, you're here now, listen up and fall in line. You cannot bring people in and then not ask them to fully use their talents and allow them the space to be listened to. So, questions or comments that people might want to fill out at this point? Have we heard these distinctions between diversity and inclusion before? People want to maybe talk through that a little bit? How many of you feel pretty comfortable about your diversity efforts in terms of the counting, the sort of accounting for? Are you collecting data in your program that speaks to diversity-related questions?
But not in all areas. You know, I would say we look at the broad categories, the things that are below the water level. We're just starting to recognize those.
So the things that are above the water level, right? Age, race, gender, skin color. Sometimes programs and institutions do a good job with working class or socioeconomic class, sort of as a marker for that. People often will use whether or not a student is Pell Grant eligible, right? So using a Pell Grant eligible marker usually suggests a student comes from a more working class or low income bracket, right? How about intersections? Are we collecting data on intersections? Meaning, are we collecting data on not just racial ethnically minoritized people, but racially ethnically minoritized women and men, or maybe non-binary individuals? So we've got to always be willing to collect at those intersections, even if it feels like the numbers are going to be so small, right? A quick side story for you. I started my academic career at Clemson University, and the Latino population, student population, and the faculty population was very small at that point. And the student population was very tiny. And I remember one time we were doing this really massive climate survey at the institutional level. And the person was presenting the results, and I noticed that Latinos were not coming up in any of the discussion. So I raised my hand and I said, well, I noticed that Latinos aren't coming up. Like they weren't in the slides at all, right? Two things. They said, well, we didn't think we had to show them because they came up just non-significant. Like it was just non-significant. I'm like, okay, well, and I shouldn't be doing this because I'm kind of throwing an institution under the bus, but I already said it. And I'm on video too, so. And so then I said, okay. And then I thought, well, why not just report out even in the raw numerics, right? The raw data. No, we just thought that because they didn't show up as non-significant, they're happy on campus. And so this is really a telling story when we think about how we track and keep diversity numbers, right? Not only should you always show the data, even if it's 2, right? You've got to confront the fact that there's only 2 in that category. Native Americans often say we're more than just an asterisk. So count and collect that data no matter what, even if it's a really small n. It's important. And you've got to be willing to talk about why it's a small n. Now, inclusivity moves us to the next level, right? Go ahead, please.
Collect that data, right? So especially underneath the water there. How do you collect a lot of that? Because it seems like a lot of this stuff can be sensitive. Like, for instance, we said socioeconomic. I mean, there's a way to do that, but that's what I always wondered. How do you try and increase diversity when sometimes it's hard to actually get that data without, like, how do you ask those questions?
Right. So that's a great question, and we're going to go through that, but I'm going to jump ahead just really quickly to give you a sense of some of the things that I do in my own work and that have been recommended. So one of the things that I often do in the beginning of my advising relationships and or mentoring relationships is I create a face sheet. And has anybody ever heard of a face sheet before? So in general, a face sheet, and I'm going to go back to this in a while, so you might hear me repeat myself, but a face sheet is really a document where you get to know, first of all, remember how I modeled for you a bit in the beginning, kind of like who I am, and I told you things that we don't often talk about in academia, right? Like a lot of people don't want to talk about I grew up poor, or I grew up very working class. You have to be willing to come with your full self. As Jack said, you've got to be willing to sort of open up, right? It becomes very uncomfortable sometimes when I'm in front of my classroom and I say, well, I grew up in a trailer, and my dad still lives in a trailer today. People are like, whoa, she said it. Yeah, that's okay though, because it creates sort of a possibility for people in their minds. And a lot of times that's what our students are talking about, or that's what our students are craving for. In fact, I just read an article in The Guardian 2 days ago that talked about it's one person's experience, but they talk about the really bad experience they had with their PhD supervisor. And I can share that back with you all if you're interested in. And there's this unwillingness for an advisor, a supervisor, to have hard conversations, open conversations, but to be vulnerable. Really, that's really what it is. So I often talk about creating a face sheet, and we'll go through this in a little while. Whoops. Okay. Oh, it looks like it kicked me out. This is a great time to get coffee or bagels. Let's see, did it go through? Oh yeah, there we go. Thanks so much, Perry. So I want to go ahead and open up our thinking about inclusivity and bridge us into equity by showing this short clip. I use this clip often, actually almost always, when I teach my class. I teach a seminar called Pro Seminar to Higher Education, and that is for our first-year doctoral students. And it's an opportunity for me to work with them and tell them this is what our field is like. These are some of the, this is an early opportunity for me to work with them and have them think about how they are going to oftentimes have to translate and work with a field that's already established, but also to assure them that there are people who are going to help them. Inclusivity, right? I often use this video also when I'm teaching a class called The Collegiate Context of Teaching and Learning. And in that class, the whole goal is to have students who are interested in faculty work think about what does teaching and learning look like in different contexts, and how does power often come into these contexts without us even recognizing it if we're not willing to step back. Now, hopefully this lets me. The person who brings someone over, sort of recruits somebody into and really sort of plays their advocate. We have somebody who's brought over, but then there are immediate questions around Mr. Srivasa's capabilities as a mathematician, the ways in which he talked about math, the ways in which he presented his work. There are immediate questions around it, and there were enduring doubts about it. And it made his transition, as you got to briefly see, and if you haven't seen this docu-movie, is what it's categorized. If you haven't seen the docu-movie, it's a great way to think about when diversity fails to go to the next level, when it fails to go to inclusivity, when it fails to consider what would be equitable opportunities for him to have capitalized on his mathematical talents. And so what are some of the thoughts that you have sort of looking at that? Can you think about a time when, for example, you had someone or you had a situation and you thought, they're really smart, I just don't know how to utilize that, and have you been more likely to shut it down? Have been more likely to spend time with that person and kind of figure out a way to translate and sort of serve as an institutional agent? Any situations? It is, it's excellent.
Independent of it coming from poverty and from India he was looking at problems in a completely different way. And maybe it's the point you're trying to make, is the openness of the faculty to be able to step back from the way they do things and to see that maybe there is something in this different approach, completely different approach, that this genius was doing, and the fact that he could skip steps in his head. He was that bright, and a big part of it, I guess, with that little introduction showed is going from the point where it's almost total rejection to total acceptance when he finally presents his thesis.
Some other thoughts on that? Thank you. Maybe building on that a bit? What does it mean? What does it mean? Oftentimes, a while ago I talked about how when we think about diversity, we often think about these categories that are very familiar to us, right? Very familiar to us. But wrapped up in these categories, and even in these categories, even the hard ones that are difficult to sort of parse out, wrapped up in that is these diverse, not to overuse the word, experiences and talents and knowledge sets and ways of presenting problems, ways of thinking through a problem, that sometimes when you're walking into a space that has been more homogeneous for the most part, it's difficult to have those diverse experiences and ways of talking about the world really heard. So for example, this is not just a situation in engineering. K-12 schools have dealt with this forever. I think about all of the work that has gone on in K-12 schools to think about how do we tap into and leverage the multiple knowledges that a child brings into a classroom. When I was walking into kindergarten, I remember that immediately my kindergarten teacher, I clearly remember this experience, my kindergarten teacher, because my last name was Gonzalez, told my parents, don't worry, we will place her in special education. And my parents were like, what? There was an assumption, right? We got past that assumption because I was lucky enough that my parents knew how to engage with the schools, right? They knew how to say, my daughter speaks English, this is her first language, she's a solid reader, she knows her numbers. So that was a privilege that I had with my parents. But did they ever tap into the kind of knowledge and experience that I had gained through my household? No. Did they ever tap into the way that I learned math from my dad? No. Growing up in New Mexico, I'm part of a tradition where Native Americans developed acequias, which are water systems, natural water systems that were developed by the Native Americans. And my family has learned how to take care of our water passages over time. It's a family knowledge that we pass down. Was that ever talked about in my science classes? No. But when we bring diversity into the classroom, people whose, by their very biographical histories, have different experiences and different knowledge sets, we bring them into a classroom, into our advising, into our research teams. How can we really tap into those kinds of knowledges, those different ways of thinking about problems, those different languages that they might use? It takes a lot of work on our part, right? It takes a lot of learning, and I like to say unlearning. It takes sort of this openness for us to say, well, I guess we could talk about this problem in a different way. Let's really listen to another. Eventually, as you saw, Ramanujan, he was accepted by the faculty. He died very young. Were his outcomes as equitable as they maybe could have been? I don't know. People will probably have different opinions on that. But equity is sort of that highest level, right? We can't get to equity for groups, for people, if we're not thinking about inclusivity. And inclusivity becomes sort of a misnomer, almost, if you don't have diversity, right? So equity gets us to our highest sort of circle, or highest point of of the house, you will. I let my cement analogy go because I didn't know where to go with it. So equity is both process and outcome, and that can feel a little yucky for people because they're like, okay, there's an outcome? Like, is there something I should be looking for? This is where I ask you to be comfortable with process, be comfortable with ongoing or continuous improvement cycles, because equity takes that. There's no one that I've ever met that has engaged in diversity work who says, we've made it, we're here, equity has been reached. No. It takes sort of this disposition around learning, ongoing tolerance for change, unlearning, and it takes sort of our commitment to ensure that when we occupy a space of power and decision making, and I'm going to get to some of those specific points in a moment, that we are committed to a process that ensures that people who come from historically marginalized or underrepresented backgrounds have the equitable opportunity to grow, contribute, and develop with attention to outcomes, right? So it's process and it's thinking about, okay, am I operating with equity in mind? For example, in my classroom, I often talk about timekeeping as a feminist act because research shows that conversations are most often dominated by men. And so I often make sure, our cohorts are quite small, maybe about 14 or so. So I often make sure that I have people who are talking and I might say, okay, well, we haven't heard from some others in the group. What's going on? You know? Or I might say, let's do a minute paper, which means let's give everybody time to sort of log down. And I might pull a name from the hat and say, are you comfortable sharing with us? Your name came out first. There's something about controlling the time and the space in a classroom or in a discussion group with equity in mind, right? So equitable practices are always ongoing. They're always about thinking about how do we need to change conditions to make sure that we're all at the same point. Now, I want to say this, but I also want to say something else. This same point, let's say the point is about landing a job, right? Getting somebody into the professoriate, making sure somebody lands a postdoc. That can be very different for different people, right? The research has shown that when you're working with, for example, students of color, they're more likely to say that they got engaged in science or engineering, medical fields, because they want to give back or they want to give to their community. So that often means that you may have a student who doesn't want to go into a big R1 institution. That might mean that you have a student who wants to work in a community college. Or it might mean that you have a student who wants to work in an HSI, which is the kind of institution I came from, a Hispanic serving institution. It might mean that you have a student who wants to go and work in an HBCU. So just because we're thinking about equity and outcomes, that doesn't mean pressure to make everyone's outcome the exact same. There has to be some wiggle room. And I say that because many times when I've been working with faculty members who have chosen to go on to teach in comprehensive or teaching intensive institutions, they often feel a sort of guilt or that they let their advisors down. And that is across disciplines. And so even as we think about equity and outcomes, we have to be listening to our advisees, and we have to be sure that we're really, really shaping a pathway for them that is in line with their values, not just our values. Okay? So I want you to go ahead and think about then diversity, inclusion, and equity as feeding into a process that's going to force you to reflect and make some adjustments. And this sort of cycle can guide your thinking in your teaching, in your advising and your mentoring, and in your research teams. Now, I want to go ahead and take some time to ask you to think about one scenario in your teaching or in the classroom, one scenario in relation to advising and mentoring, and then one scenario in relation to your research teams or research collaborations that you may be a part of. And those can shift, right? For the folks that are staff in the room, if you're thinking about how you connect with faculty, we can sort of shift some of the scenarios for you. For the grad students in the room, if you haven't had opportunity to do teaching, you can think about an experience in teaching, even when you maybe did some undergraduate teaching, something like that. So take some time, I would say about 5 to 7 minutes or so, and think about one scenario that has really stuck with you as a moment where you felt like maybe you could have done better, a moment where you felt like you didn't really quite know what to do. And I'm not promising you the answers, right? But I'm promising you a conversation that we can all sort of think through together. So think of scenarios where you think you could have done better, where you had a question, where you sort of felt like you ran into a wall with regard to these kinds of issues, okay? We're going to do that on our own, and then we're going to do some share outs, and then we're going to work in some groups processing how to kind of apply these different concepts across these different areas, okay? I'm going to go ahead and shuffle around to visit with folks who might need to construct some alternative scenarios that will work, okay? Any questions? No? All right. Are you okay? Do you have any questions? A particular scenario, and maybe you've talked with colleagues and you've thought about a few things together. I want you to this is a toolkit that I actually put together for you. Again, you're going to have an electronic copy of this website, of this PowerPoint. But I'm going to run you through the toolkit really quickly before we jump in, okay? Because I know that we are in our last half hour. So always think about, are you teaching, advising, mentoring, research? Like, what is the scenario that you're playing with? And you're going to go through your cycle, right? We're going to start with building diversity, and I'm going to take you through this in a minute. Your toolkit starts with building diversity, right? This is sort of that, I don't want to call it easiest, but it's sort of the most straightforward. It's the counting. And it's sort of, again, remembering, knowing how to count, right? Knowing that it's important that if things have been invisible or not mentioned before, that you're willing to name that in your report, in your thinking, so on and so forth.
Isn't there a first step, which is knowing what to count?
Yes.
I mean, you know, it's one thing to count these things, but it seems to me that a major effort has to be focusing on what you're really going to count when you're talking about diversity with a big D.
Mm-hmm.
There are a large number of things.
Exactly. I mean, I think that in higher education, maybe this is something that I took for granted, but in higher education, most often our efforts around diversity work are geared towards improving the status and the representation of historically underrepresented group, which include racially and ethnically minoritized groups, which include often women, which include often working class, using first generation as sort of a marker for that. But I think that we can go further, and this is important thinking about STEM more broadly, right? We can think about biology, and that's going to be a discipline where we have more representation of women. We can think about geology, and geology is one of the least diversified disciplines, right? So you're right. When we start to think about what we need to count, that's going to be context bound. It's further going to be possibly program bound, right? So maybe you're a program or a unit, I'm not sure how y'all are organized here, maybe you're a program or a unit that has done particularly well building partnerships, recruiting folks from racially minoritized backgrounds, but now you need to start looking at those intersections. Or now you need to start looking at ability statuses. Maybe now you need to start thinking about representation in terms of what you're doing around gender identity. So it is very much context bound, but in higher education, most of our efforts, and to be quite blunt, most of the funding efforts that are attached to diversity work are going to be attached to thinking about the improvement of representation among racially and ethnically minoritized groups, women, and sometimes of socioeconomic, first-gen college students. First-gen is sort of a thing that's kind of booming right now in higher education. So as you go through your toolkit, when you're on your own, when I've left, and when y'all are sitting with this in front of yourself in the summertime and you're thinking what to do with it, you're going to start with building diversity. You're going to think about, what do we need to know? Where are our gaps, right? Look at your old data. Where are the absences? Why are there asterisks, perhaps by Native Americans in the scenario I put up before? I'm going to have you think proportionally about diversity, which means that I want you to think, when you're thinking about the groups that you're interested in and building up, right? I want you to think not just about straight numerics, but I want you to think about proportions. Oftentimes people will say, well, why do we have to worry about this? If we think about the research university sector, that's where you have the most numerically, you have the most racial and ethnically minoritized faculty. And in fact, that's true, that bears out. If you're thinking across sectors of higher education and you're thinking about faculty, in the research university sector, R1s, that's where you're going to find numerically the most. But then, you've got to start thinking about a number of things. Are they proportionally or representationally represented in relation to the population? What about in relation to degree production, right? What about in relation to organizational demography? This is one of my most favorite words and favorite ways to think about diversity. Diversification efforts, if they are left sort of unbuckled from how your organization is structured, that can mean that any good efforts that you put into recruitment can easily fall away. What do I mean by that? If you think about, let's say that you hire, or let's say that you bring in postdocs, 20 of those postdocs, and you have a number of postdocs that represent racial and ethnically minoritized individuals, women of color, you have folks of different linguistic capabilities, differently abled folks, right? And you're really proud about that, right? And you're thinking, this is a great cohort. But how does that cohort fall out when they go off to their different programs? When they go off to their different departments? Meaning, the Department of Engineering or the College of Engineering and the the Department of Physics and the Department of Biology, you may have brought in a really strong cohort, but when those people fall out, they might often be very few in the department or in the program where they're going to eventually get their experience. So thinking about diversity from an organizational demographic perspective is incredibly helpful. And then thinking about your recruitment efforts. Again, I'm going to cycle through this quickly now. The next step as you work through this toolkit is going to be for you to think about inclusivity, right? So you're successful, you've done some recruiting, you have some targeted efforts, you built up that cohort. You have a cohort that you're proud of, it's more diversified than it's been in the past. How are you working to make it an inclusive experience for these folks? The first and foremost thing, there's going to be 3 things that I suggest to you. To position yourself as a learner. Now, that sounds maybe a little bit cheesy, but it's fundamental in this process. Learning about your students in authentic ways, learning and listening to them to leverage what they know in the context of the curriculum, in the context of examples in your research team, using maybe some of the phrases or the notions that they give to you is incredibly important and validating for students in the context, again, of discussion groups, for example. Number 2, self-reflection. In my research, I often, in fact, I have a paper where I talk about we often learn the most when we hold the mirror up to ourselves. And so that's really about holding a mirror up to yourself to think about what are the values that you bring into your classroom. How have you been socialized through family, through your own mentors to think about work and the place of work, the place of academia in your life? How have you been socialized to think about the place of family and friends? What are your habits around work? Going back to that article that I referenced in The Guardian, the student who wrote this article eventually left academia, didn't finish. This student talked about how the advisor emailed at all hours of the night, just excited. Did you look at the data? What are the results? And the student would just say, like, I grew up where it was really important to have some boundaries, to go home and to be with family. And it would completely freak this student out to be receiving these emails at all hours of the evening. So what are your work habits? It doesn't mean your work habits are wrong, but it means that there's a particular way about your work habits, and they can't be taken for granted as normal or good or the way, right? There are other ways. So I gave lots of little tools inside of the PowerPoint. And then actions to ensure equity. This one is incredibly important because it's about process and outcome, right? So thinking about equity means, again, when you sit down with this toolkit, when I'm no longer here, when you're talking to your colleagues, it's you all thinking about what is every touch point that I have where my decision making comes into play. For example, when I'm constructing my class syllabus, when I'm thinking about hiring, when I'm writing a letter for students. There has been several studies that show that the language that we use for writing letters for women and men often differs. So there is actually an online website that you're linked to where you can run your letters of recommendation through and check them for biases, right? What is every touch point that you have essentially for that becomes an opportunity to either advance or not someone or some group. And I have this list of questions that are really helpful for you in thinking about how you interact with each of those touch points. This one right here, are you framing someone's work as legitimate engineering work, really gets right to my own scholarship. Because I'm very interested in how scholars who do non-conventional work, how they gain value in the eyes of their peers. So for example, let's say that you're sitting in on tenure and promotion processes, or you're deliberating on a scholarship or a fellowship opportunity. And students have submitted their work and they've described their research problems, right? Or the faculty member has applied and talked about their scholarship. And someone takes up the file and says, well, I don't really understand what they're doing. It doesn't really seem like engineering work. Whoa, that small, probably comment that you didn't really recognize as being much more than a comment or sort of you puzzling it out loud puts that person on very different grounding than other people who do engineering research in maybe a more traditional kind of fashion. So what are the ways in which you frame people's work, particularly when they're coming from a different background, when that different background might be manifesting in how they talk about their engineering research, right? So these are just some questions, a checklist of questions that you can think about as you think about equity. Now I'm going to back up. I'm going to ask folks to use this toolkit in the different scenarios they came up with. So let's hear some examples of teaching. And we're going to work through these. I wanted you all to work through them in small groups, but I fear that we don't have enough time. So what is one example of teaching that folks came up with? And we can kind of process through, are we at a diversity level? Are we at inclusivity? How could we get there? What would equity look like here?
I actually had a challenge, not so much as an idea, but a place where this was kind of difficult. So one of the aspects of teaching I do would be large service courses, so maybe 250 students. From the standpoint of diversity in the sciences, that would be probably the more diverse population. So in a way, the demographics would be better than a small majors only section. But the challenge I was trying to think about in light of how you framed the discussion today is how do you, in that kind of large lecture format where interactivity may not be as extensive, how do you promote inclusion and equity in how the students are going through that large class when you don't have as many opportunities for what you were talking about in terms of the one-on-one interaction, trying to understand communication styles and get to these issues that might make someone feel more supported in the environment.
Right. That's a great question. Does anybody have another teaching scenario, or are we good to roll with this one? So, okay, I'm going to just recap this really quickly. Large service course, upwards of 250. Probably this is the best case scenario for demographics in the classroom. But the potential for that one-on-one interaction, doing the face sheet, right? Doing the face sheet in this case is quite impossible, right? Okay, so one of the tricks that I've used, and I've never had to teach a class as a faculty member that large, as when I was a master's student, I did a seminar that was about 200 students large in political science. But one of the things that that professor used to do back at University of Texas El Paso, he would use the clickers, and he would lay out some questions in an attempt to get to know who was in the room at the beginning of the semester, right? So some of the questions I vividly remember him asking, how many of the students in here are from El Paso? All right. How many of the students are from Juarez? How many of the students in here are from the interior of Mexico? How many of the students in here are from other parts of the globe? And so he would get a quick sense of the demographics in the classroom, right? And because it was political science, he would often kind of think about scenarios or political situations tied to some of those different places that people had named, right? In a large classroom like this, you can also ask students to submit problems or puzzles that they remember growing up with. So for example, you could shoot out, I would do this with SurveyMonkey, although most people don't like SurveyMonkey anymore. You could shoot out a large survey. And I'm not sure what kind of class this is specifically, organic chemistry, so I know nothing about organic chemistry. But you could give them some sort of prompt, right, where they could talk about their first interactions around chemistry or around a problem that is of significance to organic chemists. And you could ask them to relate that to thinking about something personal. And if you have RAs who could help you sift through that data, you know, so then you might want to use the word analytics in SurveyMonkey or in whatever it was. Try to pick up on some of the major themes there, right? Going back to my example where this a similar kind of situation, when I attended Highlands, I attended New Mexico Highlands University for my undergraduate. And like many of the students, I was a local, right? And I was sharing this with you earlier. New Mexico Highlands is a very small institution, but even in our large service courses, there was a good 80 of us, right? So my professors didn't necessarily know who we were. But there has been efforts at New Mexico Highlands to really play up the acequia tradition that I talked about earlier in the context of their curriculum, particularly for the folks that are working in science, geology there. There's a great attempt to understand how, this is a term I'm going to put out there, it's going to be new, but it might be interesting to you. There's an attempt at New Mexico Highlands right now to try to tap into the funds of knowledge that exist within those native northern New Mexican communities. Figuring how can we figure out what has been going on with water systems that these kids, because they're undergrads, these young people actually know about and that they're bringing into the classroom, probably not even knowing they're bringing it in, right? Probably like when my dad made me go clean the acequias, in no way did I understand that that was science work. Also, thinking about another way, my brother is a veterinarian, and oftentimes he fell back on the knowledge that he had about ranching and animals that he grew up with in the context of our family. So shooting out a survey to get to your class and kind of figuring out what do they know about organic chemistry, or what do they know about streets. Another example is, I remember when I was at University of Texas El Paso, I worked with a person, and Mary, you may know this person, Sergio Peña. He did a lot of urban development, and I remember him talking about an example in class that really stuck with me. And I thought about it at that time, and I thought, wow, if somebody had just talked to students who were from that group, that would have been maybe avoided. Dr. Peña talked to us about a situation where a big development around housing had been made in New Mexico, lots of housing development. And this housing development was supposed to be for Native American communities. Unfortunately, there was no crosstalk between the Native American communities and the developers, and so they designed the houses in a way where the Native American community didn't feel that they were culturally appropriate for the ways in which the windows had been shaped, something about the sunrise and the sunset. And so a lot of the housing didn't go to use. It didn't get used in the way it was supposed to be used. But for example, that is something that you might find out from your students that then you could incorporate as an example into your classes. So it doesn't have to always be these really intensive kind of face sheets, right? We don't always have that opportunity. But it can be sort of at least the attention to what are the experiences around engineering problems that people are bringing in that I can build into my research teams, my classroom lectures. And again, it's going to take some flexibility on your part, right? It's going to take some, like, okay, learning about acequias in New Mexico, for example. Right? This is what we would call in higher education funds of knowledge teaching. And there's an entire literature on that. And if you all are interested, I'm more than happy to send some more resources on that. That's inclusivity, right? That's moving beyond diversity. It's about moving beyond just having the students in the seat and really tapping into and leveraging what they know. How about advising? What is one of the advising and or mentoring scenarios that people might have thought about? You want to go, please?
So one thing what me and Yvette talking about, the nature of our work as being Office of Diversity undergraduates is we're immersed in that lower part of the water with our students. So I think the biggest part that where a bridge needs to happen is students not really feeling that beyond what they look like, that those other aspects of who they are will be understood and validated once they move away from us in terms of being with us in our programming, our offices and stuff like that. And so kind of that can be from the lowest point of office hours and getting faculty in office hours as first year and second year students to working with, faculty or research or as graduate students. So I think, in terms of kind of like a disconnect, be kind of moving that situation from students of color particularly only dealing with the Office of Diversity when it comes to the submersion points, and kind of putting that to where they kind of leave us and have to deal with the larger school experiences, particularly working with faculty who don't look like them or who may not understand them at those deeper levels. And I think one thing that you mentioned was the affects of these students that makes them who they are. Students that are second or third generation Nigerians or Ugandans, or students who come from the inner cities of Baltimore, the inner cities of Washington, D.C. Those different characteristics of who they are is actually the strengths of who they are and as engineering students. But I think that can be misconstrued as weaknesses or areas that are problematic. So I think the challenge is for faculty to recognize that their strength is not in their skin color, their strength is in who they are at those lower levels. And that takes some work and some connection, but I think that's kind of where the Office of Diversity and helping faculty understand the deeper levels of water, that's kind of where that needs to make the connection.
Because you almost have two types of inclusion. So they have inclusion with us within our program, but it's not a holistic inclusion that's necessary for when the students leave us, that there's a whole community that's inclusive.
These are really important points, and I think, your example makes me, and your example fits really beautifully with the idea behind inclusivity as we're talking about it today, but also this larger idea around funds of knowledge, right? And I think, Cliff, you were talking a little bit about this also a while ago, where you said sometimes there seems like there's some sort of condensation, like you're looking down on students of color and you're trying to fix them. This workshop is not that, right? Like this workshop is, how do we get to tap into the experiences and the knowledge that our students bring to us? And how do we really leverage that? which gets us to kind of here. Wait. Here. What barriers have you or the discipline or the department, right? We've got to think at these different levels. What are the barriers that you've sort of imposed, the department has imposed, that stand in the way of people with marginalized identities? What don't we realize that we are doing that is negatively impacting the more, the newer, the more diverse groups of students that we might be working with? Is it time? Okay. So I know we're time. We started a little bit late. I was seeing how long y'all would let me go over. No. I think that your point is well taken, though. I just want to wrap up and say that when we're thinking about increasing diversity, if we stop there, we usually stop with this sort of deficit view of students. When we start thinking about inclusivity and unlearning some of our own norms and values and being willing to learn from our students, this is where we really get moving towards inclusivity and towards equity. I want to just say that working with your student affairs offices on campus can be incredibly helpful if you are struggling to learn some of these issues. So if you are struggling to learn around language use, right? Reach out to somebody and ask, do you have a flyer? I had a trans student for the first time about 2 semesters ago, and I did a lot of research on figuring out what should my language practices be in this class. So do that work. It's sort of, I think, contingent upon us. So thank you all for being here today. I know I've taken up far more of your day than I was supposed to, but thank you.
Thank you so very
Oh,
much, Leslie.
thank you.
I know we are of time, but does anybody have one quick, very important question to ask Leslie? Anybody? Any question that has not been answered? Thank you
Yes,
so
of course.
much. I will have a little gift for
Oh,
you.
thank you.
And
Thank you.
for being
Thank you.
so wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
And this is the beginning, you know?
Yes, thank you. I
This is the
appreciate
beginning.
this.
We're going to
Thank
bring
you.
you again to do something else. But let's give her a hand again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thanks so much for being here, everyone. Thank you. I'm gonna give out my card.